Welcome to the 2023 Oscar preview show as presented by the Yay, Nay or Meh channel. This is a series of videos where I will be analysing the above-the-line categories at the 2023 Oscars. Even though I've been podcasting and reviewing films for over a decade now, I still consider myself an enthusiastic amateur rather than an expert. I didn't go to film school, I don't really have the training in it. This is the reason why I only do the major categories, because I honestly don't think I can give a value judgment as to what the best editing is, what the best production design is. But I do believe I can give value judgments about the best acting, the best directing, the best writing, and the best film. So that is why I only do the major categories. And I analyse the Oscars in a slightly different way than most people, because I spend almost as much time discussing what I think should have been nominated rather than what was nominated, and only limiting myself to that. And as such, these videos and in past years audio podcasts do get rather long. So what I've decided to do is split these reviews up into separate videos, and there will be one video for each category, where I will be discussing what I think will win, what I think should win, whether there were any snubs, and if there were any snubs, whether I personally think they should actually have won the Oscar. And in a couple of places I've gone really left field with what I think should win the Oscar. So this is going to be a long process. I mean, at the time of recording, it's less than a week away from the actual Oscar ceremony. So I need to be efficient and I need to be fast. And as such, I'm going to be reusing a lot of the same videos. This introduction I'm recording now will be on each of these videos. I mean, I need to introduce each of the videos in case you come across them individually. So I may as well just record one introduction and use it in each of the videos. And if you watch more than one of these, you'll be seeing this a lot. And as such, there will be a time code in the comments to tell you when the actual content starts. And when I will be talking about the same film in different categories, I'll also be reusing that video as well. So you will be seeing some repeats, but again, you can check in the time codes. And with such a vast project, you need a starting point. In certain categories, there is a shortlist. In both the documentary feature and the international feature categories, the Academy publishes a 15-film long list. And in the animated feature category, they publish a list of eligible films. And this year, there were 27 eligible animated features. But other than those categories with a specific list, the starting point that I use is the lists that are published on goldderby.com, which is basically the industry standard for this kind of Oscar preview and prediction. So if a performance or a film was listed on the Gold Derby lists of Oscar potential, there was a chance, however remote, that a performance or a film did have a chance at the Oscars. And that is the list I will be using, with a couple of tweaks which will come up during some of these videos. So that is my starting point, and if it wasn't published on goldderby.com, it's not going to be under consideration. And this has already gone on for far too long, so let's get on with this categories analysis.
Best Animated Film. Nominee.
Puss in Boots: The Last Wish was a film that got a lot of praise. It was widely expected to be one of the nominees, which indeed it was. And people seem to have really loved this film. And honestly, I just don't get it. Puss in Boots: The Last Wish is perfectly fine. I mean, it's entertaining, it does the job. It's a part of a franchise, a sequel to a long running franchise. I mean, look at the animation on the original Shrek. It's actually, by today's standards, very ropey. But it's been going a long time. People were anticipating this, and possibly that had something to do with it. I mean, this film was delayed a lot. Largely due to the pandemic, obviously, but it was delayed a lot. And possibly, I mean, I don't know this for sure, but possibly I think that is one of the things which has over promoted this film. When we saw Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, it had that sort of 2.5D approach. The same kind of thing that was done in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. It's carried on into the Mitchells versus the Machines. I mean, it has become a very popular visual aesthetic. But in the case of Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, in my opinion, they went back in and tinkered with it and converted a fully 3D rendered film into this blending of 3D and 2D. And I think possibly that's one of the things which people have responded so strongly to, is that 2.5D approach. But when I saw Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, in my opinion, they only went halfway. They didn't fully integrate those 2D sequences into the film. And I don't think it works. It felt half-assed, quite honestly. And if that is one of the reasons why Puss in Boots: The Last Wish has been praised so highly, then another film that DreamWorks put out in the same year and was also on the eligible 27 list, I think did it much better. The Bad Guys fully integrated that flattened 2.5D approach. That was a part of the entire visual aesthetic of that film. And it works. I mean, honestly, I think it's a better story as well. I mean, yes, it's a bit trite, but so is Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. If you wanted that 2.5D approach from a DreamWorks film, The Bad Guys was better. So why is everybody praising Puss in Boots: The Last Wish? I mean, particularly compared to some of the films that didn't make the cut, I don't get it. I mean, Puss in Boots is fine. It's a meh, but that's all it is, and I don't think it deserved this Oscar nomination.
Best Animated Film. Nominee.
Did you like How to Train Your Dragon? Then you're sure to love The Sea Beast. That's basically what this is. The Sea Beast is How to Train Your Dragon. It's got a very similar story, got a very similar visual aesthetic. It's only been done for the modern era and by Netflix, which just makes animation now. I mean, The Sea Beast is fine. I actually enjoyed it quite a bit. But it's adequate. When you compare it to some of the films that didn't make the cut, some genuinely inventive and original, and in certain cases very strange films that didn't make the cut in this category, like Henry Selick's Wendell and Wild, Richard Linklater's Apollo 10.5, and Phil Tippett's Mad God, which I'm not the hugest fan of, but part of me would have really liked to see Mad God get an Oscar nomination because it is so grotesque, so filthy, so squelchy. That film competing against films like Marcel the Shell with Shoes On, or Turning Red, or even Pinocchio. I would have really liked to see Mad God get an Oscar nomination, certainly over The Sea Beast, which, like I said, is fine, but that's all it is. And it really frustrates me when the Academy does something like this, which it has been known to do. I mean, go for something mainstream, something safe, something which doesn't challenge you. Just blandness, instead of something genuinely out there, like Wendell and Wild or Apollo 10.5 or Mad God. It's fine. The Sea Beast is a meh, and I don't think it deserved this Oscar nomination.
Best Animated Film. Nominee.
Over recent years, Disney has seemingly been making a concerted effort to be more open and more culturally diverse in their lead characters, in their princesses. And can you still use that term after Wreck-It Ralph 2? But whatever. And the latest Disney film dealt with a Chinese girl. I mean, yes, we already had Mulan, but here we have a Chinese-Canadian immigrant girl having her coming of age in very unusual ways. It's another long-standing trope of fantasy movies, comparing puberty and coming of age with a monster movie. I mean, Ginger Snaps is the prime example of this, another Canadian movie, actually. But here, the transformation of this 12, 13-year-old Chinese-Canadian girl into a gigantic red panda, there's some metaphors there. And I think it's done very, very well. I mean, this is a film which does deal with coming of age, which does deal with the issues that arise, the friendship groups, the changes that are going on, but also layers upon it the immigrant experience. I mean, being a young girl living in Toronto, but having a very traditional Chinese family and having to live up to those expectations. I mean, the director of this feature-length movie, Turning Red, Domi Shi, won an Oscar a few years back for her animated short, Bao, which dealt with some of the same issues. And honestly, I didn't like Bao. I think that film ends, or that short ends, in a really, really weird way. Dealing with the immigrant experience, dealing with coming of age, dealing with puberty, dealing with friendship. I mean, the friendship group in this film is so sweet. I mean, they're a group of girls who are so connected with each other, and eventually a boy as well. But yeah, all of this works really, really well. Disney has been on a bit of a high. I mean, this doesn't reach the level of Encanto, but Turning Red is a very, very good movie. In other years, it would have been a very, very worthy winner, but it's not going to beat Pinocchio. And personally speaking, I don't think it's better than Marcel the Shell of Choose On either. But Turning Red is still an excellent animated film. It thoroughly deserves this Oscar nomination, and it is a yay.
Best Animated Film. Snubbed.
Now, I do realise that I'm slightly coming from left field with this one, and there's a not unreasonable chance that you won't ever have heard of this film. But it was released by Netflix, and it was on the 27-strong list of eligible films for the Animated Feature Oscar. So it's fair game. And I actually really, really liked it. I wasn't massively interested in watching this film. It's from a Japanese animation studio called Colorido Studios, and I hadn't liked the previous Colorido Studio film I'd seen, A Whisker Away. I thought that was a film with issues, and the premise also seemed really, really strange. It's about a group of middle schoolers who are about 11, 12, 13 years old, who go into an abandoned apartment building where some of them used to live over the summer, and then somehow a giant rainstorm comes and they float off into a gigantic ocean in the apartment building. What? So yeah, that sounded such a strange premise that I just didn't bother with it, particularly since I hadn't liked A Whisker Away, which you can also find on Netflix. But when I actually watched it, I found myself really drawn into it. I mean, there is a tendency in the Western English-speaking world for animation to just be for kids, as most of the nominees and even most of the eligible films are, kids' films. But in Japan, there is sometimes a tendency for really powerful subjects and really harsh subjects to be explored in animation. I mean, going back into history, A Silent Voice was about bullying and suicide. Ride Your Wave was about grief and the inability to get past grief. And ultimately, Drifting Home is about childhood depression. it becomes more and more apparent over the course of this film that one of the characters, a little 13-year-old girl, is having a really tough time and is probably clinically depressed. I mean, and severely depressed. And all the people have to try and deal with it in this fantastical situation where they're floating on a giant ocean in an apartment block, and one of them is probably also a ghost. So, yeah, I mean, it's a weird setup. But it does explore childhood depression in a really approachable, really understandable way. And for the subject of us, I mean, the animation style is fine. I mean, it doesn't, wow you or anything. But the subject matter, I found really impactful, and it really did draw me in. So, yeah. I mean, if nothing else, treat this as a recommendation. I mean, I'm assuming most of my audience has a Netflix subscription, so all you need to do is click the button. And I did really, really like the Japanese animation Drifting Home. And for me, it is a yay, and I do think it deserved an Oscar nomination.
Best Animated Film. Snubbed.
On Oscar nomination day, I think the snub which most upset me was the fact that Wendell and Wild didn't get an animated feature Oscar nomination. I mean, it wasn't a shock like Daniel Deadweiler missing the cut or the script for The Whale missing the cut. I mean, those were like, what? I mean, everybody expected those to happen and they didn't. But this one was, it's probably going to make the Oscars, but it ended up not making it. And that upset me. Because Wendell and Wild is beautifully designed. It's got a powerful story about grief and, the physical manifestations of grief and wanting something back, wanting something to come back from the dead, and maybe that's not a good idea. Having this mythology of the demons and their interactions with this little girl in this small town, and all the demons want is to create a fun fair. I mean, a demonic fun fair, which is honestly a pretty cool idea. I mean, it's so inventive. It's got so many things going on in it, and it's directed by Henry Selick. And I think Henry Selick might be one of the most underrated directors in animation history, because when The Nightmare Before Christmas came out, it was always described as Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas. And now with Wendell and Wild, his first animated feature in a very, very long time, Jordan Peele, I think, is getting the lion's share of the credit. But Henry Selick is one of those people who is keeping stop-motion animation alive. Alongside things like Leica Studios or Aardman Studios, stop-motion animation, the tactile feel of these little puppets, these little maquettes. There's something to that. I mean, and the fact that Henry Selick made the deliberate choice that you can see the joins in the jaws. I mean, so it's not a 3D CG animated film. It's a maquette where you have to remove and put back on different jaws as you lip sync the dialogue. And you can see the joins. I mean, and you see the tactile nature of it at every point. So the design of this and the mechanics of this are very, very impressive, as is the story. I think the story is very, very good. I mean, this grieving little girl who is seduced into maybe doing something that maybe she shouldn't be doing by these demons, voiced by Key and Peele, and the consequences thereof. And yeah, I mean, everything in this film works. Its story, its design, its animation, everything works. The problem is that it's just too spooky. I mean, there are some arguably pretty harsh things in this film, and maybe that put some people off. But I still expected this to be the Netflix animated film which made the cut rather than The Sea Beast. And as I said, The Sea Beast is fine. But Wendell and Wild, I think, is great. And it really upset me and disappointed me that Wendell and Wild didn't make the cut as an Oscar nominee. I think this is a genuine snub. And for me, Wendell and Wild is a yay, and I think it deserved the Oscar nomination.
Best Animated Film will win.
Pinocchio is going to win the Best Animated Feature Oscar. Or, to be more specific, Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio is going to win the Animated Feature Oscar. Quick side note, he does have a co-director on this movie, so really it should be Guillermo del Toro and Mark Gustafson's Pinocchio, but, what marketing sells, whatever. But anyway, this version of Pinocchio is going to win the Oscar because I think the perception is, and maybe there's some truth in it, that it was a somewhat down year for Disney and Pixar. And Disney and Pixar almost always win this category, one or the other. And, I mean, we had Lightyear, Strange World, which nobody seems to like. I actually liked Strange World. I mean, the visual style of Strange World I thought was very, very good. And Turning Red was, fine. But I think this is one of those years where it is ripe for an outsider to come in and take the animated feature category. And there's not much more of an outsider than Guillermo del Toro. I mean, he is an Oscar-nominated live-action director, turning his hand to animation with the assistance of Mark Gustafson, who has a background in stop-motion animation. It's a well-regarded filmmaker taking on a classic tale, a tale that has been done very many times, including very many versions quite recently. And having Guillermo del Toro's strange visual aesthetic, having a version of Pinocchio which is not so much a boy waiting to come to life. This version of Pinocchio is kind of monstrosity, and I think Guillermo del Toro acknowledges that it is a monstrosity. It might even be seen to be a punishment for this entity that it comes to life. And that's a really weird, really strange approach to take. And the visual style of this film is very good. I mean, Guillermo del Toro was heavily inspired by a slightly avant-garde illustrator named Grizz Grimley and his illustrations for Pinocchio with this rough-hewn, half-finished version. And having this strange aesthetic and also a strange adaptation. I mean, I actually think the script for Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio by Del Toro and Patrick McHale, I think it deserves an honourable mention as Best Adapted Screenplay because the adaptation of Pinocchio I think is very, very interesting. Because in this version of Pinocchio, we have a long period with Geppetto and his son. When his son dies in an air raid, because another change that is made here is it's shifted from the late 19th century to fascist Italy, and his son dies in an air raid, and Geppetto loses himself in drink, and sometime later he hacks down the tree which is over his son's grave and turns it into a puppet, which then comes to life thanks to Sebastian J. Cricket, voiced by Ewan McGregor, and the Blue Fairy, who's a blue Babylonian monstrosity. But when Geppetto sees this living puppet, he's horrified. He doesn't really want the boy. And having that kind of angle taken that Pinocchio is wrong, this is something that should not exist, and yet it does. And that's the angle that Guillermo del Toro takes. And also by setting it in fascist Italy, Guillermo del Toro and his co-writer Patrick McHale also managed to contribute things which Guillermo del Toro has long been fascinated with. He's got a long fascination with fascism. He's done a lot of films about the Spanish Civil War. and he's got a fascination with religion. And there's a very pointed scene where Geppetto and this monstrous puppet are walking to church past the poster of Mussolini. So all the things that Del Toro is interested in are in this film. And yeah, I think the adaptation of the original stories by Carlo Collodi is very, very interesting. And I do think the script, and particularly how it was adapted for the screen, is a really, really interesting approach. So yeah, the script as well, I do think deserves attention. But this is the kind of outsider film which should have more traction more often. But a stop motion animated film in a world where 9 films out of 10 are that glossy 3D CG rendered approach, and having this very unusual and very macabre version of Pinocchio, and it works. I think it is very clearly going to win the Oscar, and I think it will deserve it. It's not going to be my personal choice, but if and when it does win the Oscar, it will be thoroughly deserved, because Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio is a yay, and I do think it deserved this Oscar nomination.
Best Animated Film should win.
Marcel the Shell with Shoes On is fucking adorable. Originally created in 2010 by Dean Fleischer Camp and his then wife Jenny Slate, this little shell who lives in a human world. I mean, it's the only animated element, these little shells, the only animated element in a live action film. So, is this an animated film? Is it not? That's the Oscars decided it was, so it is. Whatever it is, I loved this film. Marcel, voiced by Jenny Slate, sees the world with such wonder, with such optimism, with such curiosity, constantly asking questions, constantly asking sometimes uncomfortable questions, seeing the world in a completely new light, in a much more poetic light compared to the pragmatic concerns, the everyday concerns of the humans who have to work, who have to get a job, who have to get money, who have to live somewhere. But this little shell who has such a small world, and then it is suddenly shown the wider world, and it doesn't necessarily go well. It's a really powerful story about that kind of innocence and sweetness. It's also a really good film about the difference between internet culture and human culture and real life culture. Inadvertently, this little anthropomorphized shell becomes an internet celebrity, and all this shell wants to do, all Marcel wants to do, is find his family, because it's just him and his grandmother, and they just cannot survive. So they desperately need to find a family, and yet all these internet people are just coming up and want to take selfies and not helping at all, and actively harming as well. And the idea of living your life that way, with that level of optimism, and gradually having it worn down, or slightly worn down, and realizing that all is not, sweetness and light. There's also discussion of fate and death, even, in this really sweet little film. I mean, this is charming. I mean, in the world we live in today, which is so chaotic, is so divided, has so many problems, every now and again you just need comfort. You just need a balm for the soul. And that is exactly what Marcel the Shell with Shoes On is. Great a technical achievement though Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio is, and it's also very, very well written and adapted from the source material. I think Marcel the Shell with Shoes On is the film that deserves to win the Oscar. I think we need this kind of comfort. We need this kind of joy. It's simple, uncomplicated joy. And that's what Marcel the Shell with Shoes On provides. I think it should win the Oscar, and I think it's a yay. In the Best Animated Film category, the actual nominees are Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, Marcel the Shell with Shoes On, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, The Sea Beast, and Turning Red. My personal nominees would be Drifting Home, Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, Marcel the Shell with Shoes On, Turning Red, and Wendell and Wild. What I think will win is Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, and it will be a deserving winner. But my personal choice would be the utterly charming Marcel the Shell with Shoes On. And as I leave you with some honourable mentions in this category, which I think are worthy of note, a reminder that I have several more videos in this playlist which analyse different categories at the 2023 Oscars. You can check those out if you desire, even though if you watch enough of them you will have to skip some pieces of footage that I reused, including this closing statement. I am planning to do a reaction video to the Oscars themselves. I haven't quite figured out the technicals of that, but we'll have to see how that goes. And if you appreciate the kinds of things that I'm doing, I have an audio podcast. And I have various other things on this channel that you might want to check out. So you can like, comment, subscribe if you wish. And basically that's all I have for this particular video. So I'll see you next time where I shine a light on cinema, both obvious and obscure.